June 1536. The Tower of London. Henry VIII stands at the window of a cell, not as king, as a prisoner. His own guards dragged him here 3 days ago. Anne Boleyn's execution was supposed to secure his power. Instead, it triggered a rebellion. The nobles he thought he controlled. They've had enough of his tantrums, his dead wives, his break with Rome. Outside, London is celebrating, not his coronation, his removal. Parliament is meeting right now to strip away his crown. Everything he built over 27 years gone. The man who defied the Pope, who tore England from Rome, who changed the course of history, might be forced onto a ship to France by tomorrow. His brother Arthur was supposed to be king. Henry just got lucky when Arthur died. What if that luck finally ran out? What if Henry VIII became the former King of England? Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me, do you think Henry VIII deserved to lose his throne? Stick around till the end. You'll discover just how close this actually came to happening and how one overthrown king would have changed everything we know about England, America, and the modern world. Henry VIII, King of England from 1509 to 1547, born June 28, 1491, at Greenwich Palace. As the spare heir, his older brother Arthur was supposed to be king. Then Arthur died in 1502, and suddenly the backup became the main event. Young Henry was everyone's dream prince. He's 6 feet tall, athletic, could joust, play instruments, write poetry, debate theology. Think of him as the Renaissance version of that guy who's annoyingly good at everything. The people loved him. The Venetian ambassador called him the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes on. But what defined Henry was his absolute obsession with having a son. Not just any heir, a legitimate male heir. When his first wife, Catherine, couldn't give him one, he didn't just divorce her. He broke England away from the Catholic Church, created his own church, and made himself the head of it. That's not determination. That's an obsession. And once Henry got a taste of that kind of power, the nice Renaissance prince disappeared. He executed 2 of his 6 wives, beheaded his best friend Thomas More for disagreeing with him, dissolved hundreds of monasteries and seized their wealth. During his reign, Henry ordered around 300 to 500 political executions, nobles, advisors, clergy, anyone who threatened him. The guy who started as beloved became one of England's most feared tyrants. Henry was paranoid, obsessively paranoid about threats to his throne. He saw conspiracies everywhere. Anyone who looked at him wrong, anyone who questioned his decisions, anyone who might possibly have a claim to his crown gone. So the question we're exploring today has this delicious irony to it. This king who spent his entire reign eliminating anyone who might threaten his power, who executed wives and advisors and nobles just to feel secure, what if he couldn't stop his own downfall? What if all that paranoia was justified? Keep that in mind as we dive in. We're talking about the one thing Henry feared most actually happening. Let's rewind to 1536. England is a powder keg. 3 years earlier, Henry had done the unthinkable, broken England away from the Catholic Church. Not for some noble religious reformation. Not because he had theological disagreements. Because the Pope wouldn't give him a divorce. An entire country's religion changed because one man wanted a new wife. But it wasn't just about marriage. Once Henry tasted that kind of power, he couldn't stop. In 1536, his chief minister Thomas Cromwell launched the dissolution of the monasteries. Sounds bureaucratic, right? The reality was brutal. The government showed up at religious houses across England, kicked out the monks and nuns, and seized everything. Land, gold, ancient manuscripts, centuries of accumulated wealth gone straight into Henry's treasury. For the common people, this was devastating. Monasteries weren't just religious centers. They were hospitals, schools. They provided food for the poor, social services, community hubs. Imagine if someone came into your town and shut down every church, hospital, and charity overnight. But there was also an economic angle. The nobility and gentry saw an opportunity. Henry was selling off monastery lands at bargain prices. Some people were getting rich from the dissolution. Others were losing traditional support systems. This created a split in English society, those who profited from the changes and those who suffered because of them. The people were furious. But it gets worse. In May 1536, Henry executed Anne Boleyn, the wife he'd literally broken with Rome to marry. beheaded her on charges of adultery and treason, charges that were almost certainly fabricated. Then, 11 days later, he married Jane Seymour. To the average English person, their king looked increasingly unhinged. He had abandoned the faith their families had followed for 1,000 years. He was stealing from the church. He was executing wives. And his advisors, particularly Thomas Cromwell, were pushing through increasingly unpopular policies. Something had to give. October 1536, Lincolnshire, England, a rebellion erupts, not from a single dramatic moment, but from months of accumulated anger. The triggers were economic as much as religious: new taxes, rumors of church plate confiscations, fear of more radical reforms. Within days, 10,000 men had gathered in Lincolnshire. They weren't soldiers. They were farmers, craftsmen, and local gentry. They called themselves pilgrims, not rebels. This was the Pilgrimage of Grace, one of the largest uprisings in English history. Their demands were straightforward: restore the monastery, bring back the old religion, remove Thomas Cromwell and other evil advisors, address economic grievances and taxation, preserve local autonomy. Notice what they didn't demand: Henry's head. They weren't trying to kill the king. They just wanted him to stop. The movement spread like wildfire. Yorkshire joined, and Durham, then Cumberland. By November, 40,000 people had taken up arms, and these weren't peasants with pitchforks. Many were experienced soldiers, knights, lords, people who knew how to fight. Their leader was Robert Aske, a lawyer and gentleman, not some radical revolutionary, a respectable guy who had been pushed too far. He organized the rebels with remarkable discipline. No looting, no violence against civilians. They were making a point, not seeking chaos. The critical moment came in November 1536. The rebel army stood at Doncaster. Between them and London, a much smaller royal force led by the Duke of Norfolk. Henry was in serious trouble. His army was outnumbered roughly 4-1. The rebels pushed south. There was a genuine chance they could reach London. And if they reached London with 40,000 armed men while the king's support was shaky, this is where history could have pivoted. In real history, Henry did what Henry always did. He lied. He sent Norfolk to negotiate, who promised the rebels everything they wanted. Said he'd consider their demands, restore the monasteries, pardon everyone involved. The rebels, who were not revolutionaries but loyal subjects hoping for reform, believed him. They went home. And then Henry broke every promise. He arrested the leaders, executed about 200 people, including Robert Aske, who was hanged in chains in York as a warning to others, crushed the remaining monasteries even harder. The Pilgrimage of Grace became a cautionary tale about trusting Henry VIII. But what if things had gone differently? What if the rebels hadn't trusted him? What if someone in that rebel camp, maybe Aske himself, had stood up and said, "No, we know how this ends. We've seen him break promises before. We've seen him execute his own wife. Words won't work anymore. We march on London." Let's explore that scenario. Doncaster, November 1536. The Duke of Norfolk delivers Henry's promises. The rebel leaders gather to discuss. In real history, they accepted. In our scenario, Robert Aske stands up. "My lords, my friends, I want to believe in our king." But Anne Boleyn believed him too. Thomas More believed him. Look where it got them. The tent goes quiet. Lord Darcy, one of the senior nobles in the rebellion, speaks up. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we remember who we're dealing with. This is the same king who promised Catherine of Aragon she was his true wife, then threw her away. The same king who swore to uphold the church, then tore it apart. The same king who just executed a wife he'd moved heaven and earth to marry." Someone else chimes in. "But if we march on London, that's treason, that's war. We're already traitors in his eyes." Aske responds. "The moment we gathered in arms, we crossed that line. The only question is whether we trust him to keep his word, or whether we finish what we started." The debate rages for hours. Some want to accept the terms. Others are skeptical but afraid. Finally, Lord Darcy makes the deciding argument. "Gentlemen, we have 40,000 men. The king has perhaps 10,000 between here and London. We have momentum. We have popular support. If we disband now based on promises, we'll never have this chance again. And when he breaks those promises, and he will, we'll face his revenge with nothing but our individual necks on the chopping block." A vote is called. The decision: march south. Norfolk rides back to London with news that makes Henry's blood run cold. The rebels aren't stopping. They're coming for him. Henry has very few good options. His army is outnumbered. Many of his nobles are secretly sympathetic to the rebels. They don't love this whole breaking with Rome thing either. Some might defect. His treasury is decent thanks to stealing from monasteries, but he can't magic up more soldiers overnight. He could try to dig in and fight pool forces from the Scottish border, call in continental allies, make a desperate stand. But that takes time. And while he scrambles, 40,000 rebels march south, gathering supporters in every town. The longer this drags, the worse it looks. A king who can't control his own country invites challengers from all sides. He could try to negotiate from weakness, offering real concessions, but his credibility is shot. Even if the rebels believed him, accepting terms under threat of force makes him look weak. In 16th century politics, that's almost worse than losing. Weak kings don't stay kings for long. The most likely option, Henry runs, is not stupid. He's seen kings get overthrown. He knows when the game is lost. Sometimes a smart play is to live and fight another day. December 1536. Henry and Jane Seymour, married to him for about 7 months now, flee to the coast with a small group of loyalists. They board ships for Calais, the last English possession on the continent. Thomas Cromwell, ever the pragmatist, stays behind. He attempts to negotiate with the rebels, to salvage what he can of the regime he helped build. It doesn't work. Within weeks of the rebels entering London, Cromwell is arrested and executed. The chief architect of the English Reformation becomes its first major casualty when it's reversed. The rebels enter London to mixed reactions. Some cheer, others are nervous. Nobody's quite sure what happens next. Robert Ascot and Lord Darcy aren't revolutionaries. They don't want a republic. They want things back the way they were, so they need a new monarch, their obvious choice. Princess Mary. Mary Tudor, Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, was 20 years old in 1536. She's popular. She's legitimate in Catholic eyes, even though Henry declared her illegitimate. She's staunchly Catholic. She's basically perfect for what the rebels want. There's one complication. Declaring Mary queen means officially admitting Henry's marriage to Catherine was valid, which means his marriage to Anne Boleyn was invalid, which means Elizabeth Anne's daughter is definitely illegitimate. The rebels don't care. Over the next few months, they work with sympathetic bishops and convene what they claim is a legitimate parliament. They invite Mary to London and begin the process of making her queen. The full coronation takes time. Ecclesiastical approval must be secured. Proper ceremonies arranged, but by mid-1537, Mary is effectively ruling England. Meanwhile, former King Henry is stuck in Calais, watching everything he built crumble. Henry predictably is furious. He's frantically writing letters, trying to drum up support for an invasion. He's got some money from the monastery dissolutions, he's got his pride. He's got Jane Seymour, who might even be pregnant, though any child born in exile would have virtually no claim to the English throne while Mary rules. In our timeline, Jane gives birth to Edward VI in October 1537. In this alternate timeline, if she conceives around the same time and gives birth in exile, that child, let's call him Edward, will be born in France or the Netherlands, a prince without a kingdom. Henry might cling to Edward as his legitimate heir, but with Catholic Mary firmly on the English throne, the boy's prospects are bleak. But support for Henry's return, it's not happening. Francis I of France is entertained by the situation. He lets Henry stay in French territory. Having an exiled King of England in your pocket is useful for diplomatic leverage, but actually funding an invasion, that's expensive, risky, and might fail. Francis plays both sides, making vague promises to Henry while opening diplomatic channels to Mary's government. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, is Catherine's nephew. He's thrilled Henry got overthrown. His cousin Mary is now Queen of England. Why would he help Henry? The Pope. He's celebrating. The king who defied Rome is exiled. England is returning to the Catholic fold. Henry likely spends his remaining years in exile, probably dying in France or the Netherlands sometime in the 1540s, a bitter, defeated man who never regains his throne. History remembers him as the king who tried to defy Christendom and paid the price. Meanwhile, back in England, Mary's government immediately begins working to reconcile with Rome, though this is complicated and takes months of negotiation. Restore monasteries where possible. Many have been destroyed or their lands sold. Bring back traditional Catholic practices. Reach out to Charles V for a strong alliance. Deal with the complex situations in Scotland and Ireland. Secure Calais, which becomes a point of negotiation with France. Scotland has been England's rival for centuries. James V is king in 1536, and he's been watching Henry's religious changes with alarm. James is also Catholic and married to Madeleine of Valois, who died in 1537, then to Mary of Guise in 1538. In our timeline, Scotland stayed Catholic longer and maintained the old alliance with France. Anglo-Scottish relations were hostile. In this alternate timeline, with Catholic Mary on the English throne, Anglo-Scottish relations warm considerably. Mary and James are both young Catholic monarchs working to preserve traditional religion against Protestant movements. While a personal marriage between them is impossible, James is already married. They could negotiate stronger alliances, perhaps through future marriages between their potential children. England and Scotland might even discuss eventual union of the crowns, something that won't happen in real history until 1603. This fundamentally changes the border warfare and raiding that plagued Anglo-Scottish relations in our timeline. Ireland in 1536 was under English control, but barely. It's costly, complicated, and many Irish lords are only nominally loyal. Henry's religious changes had been unpopular there too. With Mary on the throne, Ireland might actually become more stable in the short term. Catholic queen, Catholic population, less religious friction, though England's grip on Ireland would likely remain weak regardless. The absence of religious conflict as a rallying point for rebellion could mean fewer uprisings in the latter half of the 16th century. Let's zoom out to Europe. 1536 is right in the middle of the Reformation. Martin Luther nailed his theses to the church door in 1517. Protestant movements are spreading through Germany, Scandinavia, parts of Switzerland. The religious map of Europe is being redrawn. In our timeline, Protestant England became a crucial counterweight to Catholic powers. England supported Protestant movements in the Netherlands, Germany, and Scotland. English money and ships helped Protestant causes survive against Catholic opposition. In this alternate timeline, England goes back to being Catholic. It stays Catholic. Protestant movements lose a major potential ally. The balance of power shifts. The Dutch revolt against Catholic Spain, which, in our timeline, got crucial English support, faces much longer odds. Without English naval power and financing, the Dutch rebellion might fail entirely, or succeed only in a smaller territory. Germany's Protestant princes lose a potential counterweight to Catholic Habsburg power. The Reformation still happens. It's too established in parts of Germany, Scandinavia, and Switzerland to erase completely. But without Protestant England as a naval power and financial supporter, Protestant movements are more contained, more defensive, less able to expand. The religious wars of the mid-1500s might be shorter but more decisive. Catholicism could reassert control over more of Europe. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 might look different, perhaps more favorable to Catholic powers, or perhaps not even necessary if Protestant movements have been largely contained. England's colonial empire, the thing that eventually became the British Empire, was deeply connected to its Protestant identity, though not entirely dependent on it. English colonization of North America was partially driven by Protestant refugees seeking religious freedom. The Mayflower Pilgrims in 1620, the Puritans in Massachusetts. These people were fleeing religious persecution. In our alternate timeline, Catholic England isn't sending Protestant refugees to America. It might still send colonists. The Spanish and Portuguese are making money in the New World, but the character is completely different. The Catholic English colonies would look more like Spanish or Portuguese colonies, more focused on extracting resources and converting natives, less focused on building new Protestant communities, more hierarchical, less democratic in their initial structure. The specific cultural DNA that eventually leads to the American Revolution, Protestant descent. Parliamentary traditions, skepticism of absolute monarchy doesn't develop in the same way. Maybe France dominates North American colonization instead. Maybe Spain extends further north without English competition. Maybe the Dutch carve out a bigger empire. North American colonies would still exist. The geography and resources are too valuable, but they'd be fundamentally different in character. Let's jump forward to 1600. In our timeline, Queen Elizabeth I has ruled England for 42 years. England has defeated the Spanish Armada, become a major European power, and is beginning to establish colonies in North America. The Elizabethan age is producing Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser. England is the leading Protestant power in Europe. In the alternate timeline, things look different. Mary I ruled until she died naturally, let's say in the 1560s, giving her a reign of about 25 to 30 years. Her heir would likely be chosen from among European Catholic royal houses, possibly a child of her own if she married, or a negotiated successor from the extended royal family. England remains a solid Catholic power, allied with Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, focused more on continental politics than naval expansion. The major difference is that there's no ideological conflict between Catholic Spain and Catholic England. The Anglo-Spanish rivalry that defined late 16th century Europe doesn't happen the same way. Without that rivalry driving English naval innovation and colonial competition, someone else might fill that role. France becomes the primary Catholic challenger to Spain in some areas. The Netherlands, if it successfully rebels, becomes the Protestant naval power, though without English support that rebellion faces much longer odds. The English language doesn't spread globally the way it did in our timeline. English remains an important regional language in Britain, but not the world language it became by the 20th century. Spanish or French become the primary languages of international trade and diplomacy instead. English culture develops along a different path. The King James Bible, published in 1611 in our timeline, shaped the English language profoundly. Its phrases entered common speech. Its rhythms influenced English literature for centuries. In a Catholic England, there's no King James Bible, no Protestant translation project. English speakers use Latin liturgy or Catholic-approved translations. The language develops differently, perhaps less accessible, perhaps with different vocabulary and rhythms. English literature develops in a different cultural context. The Protestant themes of individual conscience, personal relationship with God, and skepticism of religious authority that influenced so much English writing from John Milton to John Bunyan either don't emerge or emerge differently. As for Shakespeare, well, whether William Shakespeare as we know him would even exist is unknowable. His parents' meeting, his birth, his specific life circumstances depended on countless small events. The butterfly effect from such a major historical change makes it impossible to predict. But even if someone named William Shakespeare was born in 1564 in Stratford, the cultural environment that shaped his work would be fundamentally different. His plays might explore different themes, use different references, and reflect different concerns. The scientific revolution raises interesting questions. Many early modern scientists were working in Protestant countries where there was sometimes more intellectual freedom, though the Catholic Church also supported plenty of scientific work. England still produces scientists and thinkers, but without the specific ferment of religious controversy and the Protestant emphasis on individual interpretation and questioning, intellectual development might follow different patterns. By 1700 in our timeline, England, now Britain after union with Scotland, is on its way to becoming a global superpower. It's building an empire that will eventually cover a quarter of the world's land surface. In the alternate timeline, Catholic England is probably a respectable mid-tier European power. Important, but not exceptional. Maybe it has some colonies, but they're smaller and more focused on trade than settlement. Scotland, having maintained warmer relations with England throughout the 1500s, might have united with England earlier if both remained Catholic and saw mutual advantage. Or they might have stayed separate kingdoms with strong alliances. Ireland remains complicated regardless of who's in charge. Though without the religious dimension to conflict, rebellions might be less frequent or take different forms. Without the British Empire spreading English common law, parliamentary democracy, and certain forms of capitalism, these ideas follow a completely different path. They might still emerge. Human societies often develop similar solutions to similar problems, but they wouldn't carry the specific English character. And they might not spread as widely or as quickly. Australia is probably colonized by France or the Dutch. If it's colonized at all by 1700, India sees different European powers competing for control, with Portugal or France potentially dominating. Africa's eventual colonial scramble happens differently if Britain isn't a major player. So what does all this mean for today? The global language of business, science, and the internet is probably Spanish or French, not English. This video would be in a different language. The dominance of English language media, from Hollywood to streaming services, wouldn't exist. The United States, if it exists, is fundamentally different. Maybe it's a collection of French and Spanish colonies that eventually gained independence. Maybe it develops along different cultural lines, less individualistic, more communitarian, different legal traditions, different political philosophy, common law legal systems, which spread through British colonization to the US, Canada, Australia, India, and beyond, would be far less widespread. Civil law systems based on Roman law and more common in Catholic countries might dominate instead. The Protestant work ethic that some scholars argue drove Anglo-American capitalism wouldn't shape global business culture in the same way. Economic development might follow different patterns, though whether those patterns would be more or less successful is impossible to say. The specific political traditions that led to modern parliamentary democracy, while they have roots in many places, were particularly shaped by English and American experience. Without that influence, democratic development worldwide might look different, might happen faster in some places and slower in others. So here's the answer to our original question. What if Henry VIII had been overthrown and exiled in 1536? England stays Catholic. The English Reformation is reversed before it really takes hold. Protestant movements in Europe lose a crucial ally. English colonization, if it happens at all, follows different patterns. The English language hasn't become the global lingua franca. The specific political and cultural traditions that led to the Anglosphere Britain, America, Canada, Australia, and their global influence don't develop. Would the world be better or worse? That's impossible to say. Different doesn't mean better or worse, just different. Maybe without certain Protestant-Catholic conflicts, European wars would have been less bloody. Maybe other nations would have built empires that spread equally valuable ideas. Maybe scientific and cultural development would have proceeded along different but equally fruitful lines. Or maybe the world would be less economically dynamic without Anglo-American capitalism. Maybe less innovative without the specific intellectual ferment that Protestant England contributed. Maybe more authoritarian without certain democratic traditions. We can't know. We can only trace the most likely immediate consequences and acknowledge that the further we project into the future, the more uncertain our predictions become. What we do know is this: Henry VIII's personal obsessions, his need for a male heir, his defiance of the Pope, his break with Rome accidentally made England Protestant. And Protestant England shaped the modern world in profound ways Henry never imagined and probably wouldn't have cared about. The pilgrimage of grace failed. Robert Aske trusted Henry's promises and paid with his life, hanged in chains in York. The rebels went home, and Henry consolidated his power more brutally than before. But for a few weeks in November 1536, it could have gone differently. One different decision. No, we don't trust him. We march on London and everything changes. The biggest transformations in history sometimes hinge on the smallest moments. A decision in a tent in Doncaster. A choice between trusting a promise or following through. In our timeline, they chose trust. And in choosing trust when they should have chosen action, they accidentally helped create the world we live in today. Before you go, drop a comment and tell me which king or emperor you want to see next. I read every comment, and honestly, some of your suggestions have led to the best videos on this channel. So don't hold back, give me your most interesting picks. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button. We're diving deep into history's biggest what-ifs and untold stories every week. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.